Hello and welcome. I'm Riz Khan. I'm disappointed in President Putin is how the US leader described his mood during his trip to Scotland, where he added that he was reducing the deadline for the Russian president to reach a peace deal with Ukraine. 10 to 12 days is the window Donald Trump offered, replacing the original 50-day deadline due to be reached in early September. The consequences of the Kremlin failing to do so would be massive secondary tariffs on Moscow's trade partners. Well, this turnaround in attitude towards Russia comes 5 months after the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, was very publicly berated during a meeting with Donald Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance at the White House, when it seemed to many that Vladimir Putin was the favored party in the conflict that's now into its 4th year. Well, to pick apart some of the changing issues in the war, I spoke with veteran journalist Christian Caryl, a columnist with Foreign Policy magazine who closely follows the conflict. Christian, thanks for making the time to discuss this issue, especially as it's quite topical. Donald Trump has now changed the deadline for Vladimir Putin to come up with a solution, a ceasefire. He said 10 to 12 days. Originally, it was going to be in September. What do you realistically expect to happen in 10 to 12 days?
I'm not sure I know what I expect to happen because Donald Trump is such a moving target. You know, he never really comes down decisively on the side of a particular option, or at least quite often does not come down on the side of a particular option. So I'm hoping that at the end of 10 to 12 days, we will see a very decisive statement imposing sanctions on Russia, but more importantly, secondary sanctions on China and India and the countries that have been buying Russian oil and gas since the start of the war, because that's what we really need. Sanctions against Russia are not very important. The United States does not have a lot of bilateral trade with the Russian Federation. It's just not a big target. The big target is those third countries which have been continuing to buy Russian energy. They're the ones we really need to crack down on.
Basically, when it comes down to Donald Trump changing his mind on and off, this doesn't mean that it's a fixed target anyway, does it?
I don't think it does. I mean, consider the fact he started off with a 50-day target. A lot of us were very skeptical. A lot of commentators, I think, were very skeptical about that. I certainly was. We've seen again and again and again that his deadlines and ultimatums are actually sort of sliding targets. You know, there's this phrase going around Washington that Trump is maybe, you know, always chickens out. I don't know that that's necessarily true, but he's certainly very fluid about the goals that he sets. I think he's always trying to leave himself space to declare victory, right? He likes to set up complicated situations, and then when there's some progress in his favor, he can make a big statement. He's very, very good at proclaiming his own successes. He's a real master at that. So I think what he often does is he sets up a complicated time frame or a complicated target or a target he knows is unrealistically high, and then when he achieves part of it, he claims a great victory. And he may very well do that in this case, too. But the main thing, again, is that we see serious sanctions against the people who have been supporting the Russian economy by buying its energy.
Do you think, Christian, that Vladimir Putin will take Donald Trump's pressure, his deadlines seriously?
I actually don't think that Vladimir Putin is taking Trump's deadline seriously. For one thing, he knows that the direct threat of tariffs on the Russian economy is not going to hurt him very much. He's not concerned about that. For another, I think he doesn't believe that it's going to be possible to crack down on this secondary market and well, the trading of Russian energy resources by people who are essentially evading sanctions. I don't think he believes that China and India will stop buying Russian energy and that Trump will punish them for it. He knows perfectly well that Trump has other agendas in play. Trump has a great relationship with Narendra Modi and wants to preserve his good relations with India. He has an entirely separate agenda of things that he wants to accomplish with China. So I think I'm really not holding my breath to see Trump impose these draconian sanctions on countries that are buying Russian oil and gas. I just don't believe it. I would be very happy to be proven wrong, because that would be a huge help to Ukraine to crack down on this trade in Russian energy. But I just don't believe it's happening. And another reason why I don't believe it's happening is because there's a very, very tough and expansive package of sanctions now moving its way through the Senate, sponsored by some very powerful senators, that would impose huge sanctions on these countries, third countries that are buying Russian oil. And Trump has not said a single word about whether he approves of that legislation or doesn't. We suspect that he isn't keen to sign off on that legislation because he doesn't want to give any of his power away to Congress. He's been very consistent in trying to prevent Congress from usurping what he sees as his powers to sanction countries or impose tariffs. But those sanctions that are currently making their way through the Senate are really quite draconian, and with the full power of the Congress behind them, they might actually get implemented and do something. But just leaving it all up to Trump, I think, is not really a very safe bet.
Now, critics might say he tends to think in a very linear way,
yes,
whereas the relationships are far more of a web. So, if he's going to punish China and India for buying Russian oil, it tangles up all the other relationships. There's the tariffs issue. There's apart from trade, there's the politics, the diplomacy. So, is it possible to get anything done in a linear way in such a multi-connected world?
Well, I think that's a great point, Riz. I think the answer is no. Also, one reason why I'm also very skeptical about precisely that thing is that he doesn't seem to have a clear strategy. He seems very situational. It's sort of, a month ago, Putin was doing exactly the same stuff, but Trump didn't seem, or 2 months ago, 5 months ago, Putin was doing exactly the same things he's doing now. If anything, he's intensified his attacks on Ukraine, but he was essentially doing the same things then that he's doing now. Trump was fine with it. So now he's decided he's skeptical about Putin. And to be honest, I don't really understand why, because Putin's the same guy. He's pursuing the same strategy. He's never shown for a second that he wants to end the war. That's the bottom line. Putin started this war. Ukraine didn't start it. Putin started it. Very personally, Putin, yes, and Russia. So why would Putin stop it? I haven't heard the strategic calculation from Trump. He just seemed to assume that Putin wanted to have a ceasefire to stop the war. Why? Why would he do that? It's his war. He started it. The only way he'll stop it is if somebody puts really, really hard pressure on him and makes him squeak. If you don't do that, nothing's going to happen. He doesn't want to end the war.
I'm going to get back to this in a second, but let me kind of march back through some of the history that certainly the critics bring up, and that is that Russia was promised NATO would not take even an inch step, going east. So those who support Vladimir Putin say, well, look, and Russia say that basically Russia's been cheated, if you like, by the Western allies in their expansion into the former Soviet territory, and that this is the justification to a large degree. How do you, when you hear those kind of comments, how do you regard that? That there is some justification on the part of Putin, perhaps?
Well, first of all, we don't have to litigate the whole thing now, but the idea that the West promised it would not expand NATO and then broke its promise is a little complicated. One principle that NATO has always made very clear is that countries can apply to join, right? That's their free choice. And the people who ran NATO and the president of the various presidents of the United States never said, Poland or the Czech Republic can never apply to join NATO. They never said that. The idea that the West made a promise it wouldn't expand NATO is, I think, actually not quite right. There were specific promises made about not stationing Soviet troops in East Germany after the unification of Germany that were then kind of taken by some of the Russians in a more general way. But let's assume that Russia feels threatened by NATO. If Russia feels threatened by NATO, why, for example, then is Russia trying to simply take over all of Ukraine, destroy Ukrainian cultural institutions, bomb Ukrainian publishing houses and libraries, bomb Ukrainian churches with, precision-guided weapons in many cases? Why is it also staging a war on Ukrainian culture? And why does Putin persistently deny the existence of Ukraine as a nation?
So what you're saying is that the action of Russia against Ukraine is not commensurate with the idea of this broken promise.
Yeah. They seem to have a whole raft of other things they want to do in Ukraine, including denouncing, the whole country's leadership, which is led by a Jewish person, President Zelensky, as neo-Nazi, right? There seems to be a whole range of other cultural objectives here, which have to do with the fact that Putin is a Russian imperialist, and he's never been able to imagine a Russia without Ukraine, or at least a big chunk of Ukraine in it, right?
Isn't that the mistake a lot of people make, saying he wants to bring back the Soviet Union when it's actually more about the whole idea of being a czar?
Yeah, I think that's correct. It's more about an imperial Russia. Someone once said that Russia without Ukraine is not really an empire, right? And I think that's probably true. Ukraine is a democracy. It has a lot of problems. It could hardly be otherwise. It left the Soviet Union 35 years ago. But it is a democracy. Zelensky is a genuinely elected leader, which you can't say about Putin. So what you have right there on Russia's border is a big, strong, relatively wealthy and powerful country with a very vibrant democracy. When people don't like something in Ukraine, they take to the streets, they demonstrate, they demand better of their leaders. They don't just shut up and put up with it.
They even elected a comedian.
Which is pretty brilliant,
right.
Actually. I see Zelensky as kind of a Ronald Reagan figure, somebody who started off in show business and understood some of those skills transfer very well to politics. I mean, you could say that about Trump as well. But one thing that's very clear is that Putin does not see Ukraine as an independent nation. He doesn't see Ukraine as a nation that deserves to have its own destiny. He sees it as a vassal state, a state that belongs to him, essentially. And one of the reasons why it's such a huge threat to him is precisely because it's a democracy. You can't have a big, strong country with a bunch of Russian-speaking people in it acting like citizens of a democracy right on the border with Russia. That's the last thing Putin wants, right?
Like a viral spread into Russia.
Yeah.
So I'm going to get back to Ukraine, because I know you were there last year. But let's get back to this issue between, the relationship between Trump and Putin for a minute. And I interjected just to get some historical perspective. But what do you think the actual relationship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin is like?
Well, that's a great question. I haven't been in the room. In some of their meetings, they even excluded note takers, and the famous meeting in Helsinki where it was just Putin and Trump and their interpreters in the room. So it's a little hard to say. I mean, they purposely tried to obfuscate that a little bit. But I think one thing that's very clear is that Trump does admire Putin's style of leadership. I don't know that there was, that Putin has compromising material on Trump from, old Soviet days or post-Soviet days. I don't know. And to be honest, it's kind of irrelevant. We see what we see, which is a very clear pattern since Trump came to the presidency in 2016 of flattery and adulation of Putin, right? Most famously, again, in that meeting in Helsinki, where Trump disavowed his own intelligence agencies, the assessment of his own intelligence agencies, and said, I trust this guy more than I trust the people in my own government. That's I'm still trying to get over that moment, right? That was one of the most extraordinary moments in recent American history. People seem to have mostly forgotten it. So it isn't about whether Putin's got something on him. That's simplistic. We've seen a very clear pattern of Trump admiring Putin. I think it's simply because he admires Putin's style. He admires the style of leadership. He wants to be a leader like that. I think that's a pretty modest hypothesis. I mean, everything fits that pattern.
Well, another extraordinary moment, Christian, was when Volodymyr Zelensky turns up at the White House and suddenly gets a real earful from both President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance. What went through your head when you saw what was going on there?
Well, I was absolutely flabbergasted when I saw that meeting.
Were you expecting anything like that?
I was really not expecting anything like that. The degree of contempt, open contempt, that Vance and Trump were displaying towards Zelensky was quite astonishing. You could see it in Zelensky's face. He wandered into an ambush and didn't realize that's what was happening. He thought he was being received as a fellow head of state, which under normal conditions should be a pretty basic assumption. And he wandered into an ambush, and he was completely, I think he was also flabbergasted. It was really a shameful moment for the United States and for American diplomacy. Ukrainians certainly have not forgotten it, right?
It rallied the Europeans against Russia a bit more, though, didn't it?
It did, absolutely. I think you're quite right about that. It was a huge wake-up call for the Europeans, and I think they have not forgotten it either. They've tried to put a good face on things. I think they've done a good job of trying to work with Trump. As we've seen from some recent reporting, they've been working flat out behind the scenes to repair that break between Trump and Zelensky, and they seem to have had a lot of success. It's been really quite a remarkable turnaround since then, but I don't entirely trust it, and I don't think the Ukrainians do either. Trump has said Putin's been doing some bad things lately. I don't like them. He's been sending missiles into Ukrainian cities. Well, where was he for the previous 3 years? It's like the rest of the war didn't happen. When the Russians have been perpetrating atrocities in Ukraine for almost 4 years now. I mean, it's going on. It's going to be 4 years pretty soon. So somehow that didn't elicit Trump's sympathy or indignation. It's kind of extraordinary. So one wonders how much substance there is to this recent shift, as many are calling it. I'm inclined to be a little skeptical. I still think that everything Trump has done shows that his instinctive sympathies go to authoritarian leaders. And Putin is somehow the embodiment of the values that he really wants to emulate. There is also the issue, if I may, Riz,
Please.
if I may,
Yeah.
of Trump apparently has this idea that he can woo the Russians, bring them over to our side, and create a common front against the Chinese. Some people call this the reverse Nixon. Nixon famously forged an alliance with Mao Zedong and Communist China to marginalize the Soviet Union. But I don't think you can do a reverse Nixon. I don't think Trump is the man to pull it off. I don't think it can be done. Russia and China are joined at the hip now, right? They are so close on so many levels, strategically, economically, mentally. They both decry the decadent West. You can't just, what is Trump going to offer them? Again, we have almost no trade with the Chinese. We might build up our trade a little bit, but we're the greatest energy exporter in the world. Russia is one of the other great energy exporters in the world. How do we synergize that? Actually, we're innate competitors economically. So I just don't see how that works.
So if Donald Trump admires Vladimir Putin and kind of likes the idea of emulating such a strong leader, is there any room for right or wrong with what's going on? Or is it just ego-driven?
What do you mean?
Well, if Donald Trump is big concern, or I guess the issue that he favors is that this is a strong leader, he likes that, he wants to emulate that kind of leadership. The issue of all the deaths, all the destruction stuff seems to kind of then be pushed to one side.
I think it is pushed to one side. I think Trump has shown very clearly he's a power politician. He doesn't have a very strong record on defense of human rights. He doesn't seem very concerned about those things unless there are other reasons to be concerned about them. Putin has been violating the human rights of Russians for going on 25 years now. He's launched this absolutely superfluous, gratuitous war in Ukraine, completely a war of choice. It was not forced upon him by anyone. And again, as I said earlier, Trump never seems to have been particularly disturbed by that. Trump feels threatened by China. He wants to contain China. But during his first term in office, he was strikingly silent about Chinese human rights violations. He could have used that as a very powerful cudgel against the Chinese, and they did pass some good, human rights legislation addressing the problem of minorities in China during his first term, but he barely said a word about it. He doesn't really seem fundamentally concerned about human rights. I don't think he trusts rhetoric about human rights. He, again, is a power politician. He believes in realpolitik. He believes in strong leaders. I think when you really pin him down on it, he'll say, oh, all that talk of human rights is kind of fluffy nonsense. Yeah, I don't want to see people killed in Ukraine. I don't want to see babies starving in Gaza. But, you know.
All this time, as you say, nearly 4 years, the level of death and destruction has been pretty severe. Eyes shifted off Ukraine, Russia because of Gaza becoming so desperate. And the news cycle is fickle, as you know.
Yeah.
But the level of destruction is pretty great. Now, you're a Russian speaker, fluent Russian speaker. You were in Ukraine last year.
Yeah.
Around what, September, October?
September and October, yeah, 8 weeks.
What did you see there, Christian?
What I saw was very inspiring. I saw a nation of citizens, right? Not subjects, not people obeying a king or a dictator, a nation of citizens, people taking initiative, fighting for their own rights as citizens of a sovereign state. What you see here, you see a huge level of volunteerism, you see a huge level of civic activism, and above all, this incredible creativity, right, that people have shown in pursuing this war. When the Russians invaded, the Ukrainian military was caught off guard. You might remember that we gave lots of warnings, and Zelensky didn't necessarily take them that seriously. And so the Russians made a lot of progress in the initial hours of the invasion. And then what happened? Citizens grabbed guns and went out to the streets to defend their country. That is actually what happened. So, you know, I went in October to Kharkiv, which is a city about 40 miles from Russia, and I met members of this brigade that's defending the city. And the people who are in that brigade are, you know, PR executives, a poet, famous Ukrainian poet, lawyers, IT specialists who are part of this unit. They were not soldiers before the start of the invasion, and now they're fighting for their country. And they're devising all kinds of extraordinary creative strategies and gadgets and techniques to thwart what the Russians are doing. It's very inspiring. It's heartbreaking, too, of course, because the level of destruction is insane. But it is inspiring.
Were you expecting the level of resilience from Ukrainians and the fact they've been able to hold out so long?
I think it's one thing when you hear about it and you see the news. It's another thing when you see it in front of you, right? Just the spirit is incredible, right? Like people, you know, they don't want to give up what they have. You know, they've put a lot of work into this country since 1991, and they really don't want to give up their achievements, a lot of very hard-won achievements. You know, building up democratic institutions. And as I said, it's still very much a work in progress. But that's what people think they're defending, okay? They're defending these achievements that they have largely won through their own hard work and pluck.
What were the stories, while you were there, what were the stories that surprised you, Christian?
You know, that's a great question. I don't know. I found so much that was surprising. I was giving lectures at the Kiev School of Economics, which is a fantastic big shout out to the Kiev School of Economics. It's a fantastic, relatively young educational institution and enjoys a lot of support from the EU and various donors. You go in, you might think you were in Finland or something. You know, it's this beautiful modern building. And, you know, I was giving lectures on various topics. Then every now and then we'd have an air raid siren. And then the whole class would go downstairs to the air raid shelter and I would continue my lecture. You know, it's that kind of, you know, they weren't going to let the war stop their education. That would be a defeat. And it's that kind of resilience. I think that's a wonderful word that you picked up there that is very characteristic.
What level of destruction did you witness, both in terms of infrastructure and in terms of society? Because sometimes we hear about, you know, people still go out, they meet in coffee shops, that life goes on. Again, it depends on where and, you know, where in the country and what's being attacked. But that again, resilience must take a bit of a hammering.
Look, I think it's an entire country. You can be deceived because, yes, those cafes are open and those restaurants are open and they're full and people are going out. but it is quite deceptive. There was a poll taken not too long ago. I can't remember the exact number, but basically it was something like 75% of Ukrainians said they had a loved one or a friend who had been killed in the war. So it's basically an entire society suffering from some degree of post-traumatic stress disorder. They cover it up pretty well. They're determined to go on fighting, but there's a reason why, you know, millions and millions and millions of people have left. They're afraid, right? Kharkiv was a city, you don't wander around, Kiev is not a bombed out city, right? It's not like the East End during the Blitz. You can wander around Kiev for hours and never see destruction, never, you know, forget the fact, you never remember the fact that you're in a country at war. But if you go to Kharkiv, there are whole areas that have been blasted into rubble. When I was there a few weeks earlier, a young artist, the people very well known in the local community, had been just walking through a public park with a friend, and a shell came down and blew them to smithereens. And you experience that very directly in a place like Kharkiv. It's still a beautiful city. It's still surviving. Again, there are some restaurants open and people are going about their normal lives, but there you really feel it. And by the way, talk about resilience. I was driving through Kiev one day with my friend, and we passed through an intersection right in the middle of Kiev, and he said, by the way, in the opening days of the war, the Russians hit this intersection with a ballistic missile. It went right in there, and there was a gigantic crater, I think he said 10 or 15 feet deep. And, you know, absolutely devastating attack. And by the next morning, they had filled up the hole. You know, they just were determined not to let this dominate their lives. They were going to fill in the hole. And I think that's a pretty good metaphor of the whole situation. I mean, there is no possible reason why Ukraine should still exist. Putin has thrown everything he has at that country. If you had told me in January 2022 that, you know, Ukraine was still going to be around 4 months after Putin launched an all-out invasion, I would have laughed at you. And here they are.
Well, almost 4 years in, what sort of impact do you think this will have on the generations, the younger generations, when it comes to how they will regard Russia, the ones who are non-Russian Ukrainians or of Russian origin? How do you think this is going to play out in the long term when it comes to the relationship between Ukrainians and Russians?
Well, look, Ukrainians were already, all the polls showed, very pro-European and pro-Western before this phase of the war started. I mean, we have to remember the war really started in 2014, so it's been going on a long time. So I think that pro-Western orientation will only increase. The ties between Ukraine and Western Europe will only increase because of the millions of Ukrainians who have migrated to every country in Europe and are living there now. That's merely going to strengthen this bond. And I think we've seen in the course of the past 3.5 years how disgusted the majority of Ukrainians have become by what the Russians are doing.
What about the Russian Ukrainians? Well, I mean those of Russian origin.
Well, there are Russian-speaking.
Okay.
Russian-speaking, I think, is a good word.
Is it okay?
Sure.
I mean, ethnically, because of the way the Soviet Union mixed up people.
Yes.
I presume quite a few who are ethnically Russian in the sense of from that.
Sure.
They would have been mixed.
Yeah, that's a very mixed picture. Some of them sided with Putin. You know, felt they were being, you know, that they were being infringed upon somehow by the Ukrainian government. Okay, I get it. There are some people from Eastern Ukraine who have sided with Russia, unquestionably. You know, there are a lot of Russian-speaking Ukrainians who are completely on Zelensky's side. Kiev, before this invasion, was a Russian-speaking city, largely. There are parts of Ukraine where they speak Ukrainian, have always spoken, majority has already spoken Ukrainian, always spoken Ukrainian. But Kiev was very much a Russian-speaking city. And when I took trips with taxi drivers, we would speak Russian. Nobody had any problem with that. But, you know, this sense of disgust is very palpable. And even in Kiev now, you hear people making an effort to speak Ukrainian and not to use Russian as a reaction. And, you know, even after 2014, you could still, opinion polls showed when, you know, when Russia first invaded Ukraine, 2014, and seized Crimea, You know, opinion polls were still, up until that point, opinion polls, 2013, were still showing that most Ukrainians had a fairly favorable view of Russians. Okay? Ukrainians were not anti-Russian. What made them anti-Russian? Not some weird Western conspiracy. It was the actions of Russia. You know, Russia has a great history of alienating people who are well disposed towards it. I mean, ask, you know, the Iranians or the Syrians, you know, having Russia as a friend sometimes is a bit worse than having Russia as an enemy.
Well, that's why I wonder, perhaps, as time goes on, whether Ukraine and Russia would ever be able to have a normal relationship anymore.
Yes.
You think they would?
That's a great question. When I asked my Ukrainian friends about it, some of them drew a comparison between Israel and Germany. Said right now it's unthinkable. Perhaps down the line, you know, many years from now, especially if Putin's no longer in power and there's a different regime in place in Russia, then you might be able to talk about it, just as Israel and democratic Germany now have a fairly good relationship. You know, the German, and how did that happen? The Germans accepted their collective responsibility for the crimes of the Holocaust. They recognized their crimes. They paid reparations to the Israelis, which were very helpful in the early establishment of the Israeli state. And they have good relations now.
Do you think that...
And that, you know, that could one day happen between Ukraine and a more democratically oriented Russia.
Do you think Russia, without Vladimir Putin at the helm, if something was to happen to him, would continue this campaign? Or is this purely Vladimir Putin's campaign?
I wonder, you know, that's a question I've debated a lot with my Ukrainian friends. To what extent do the Russian people support this war? And I suspect that a majority of Russians probably support what Putin is doing. And a lot of that is the product of propaganda and, you know, very, very toxic Russian imperialist traditions. But if you take away the dictatorship in Russia and you expose people to broader information, I think some things might change down the road. You know, I was a bureau chief in Tokyo and Moscow, and I also lived in Berlin, okay? So if you've lived in Berlin and Tokyo for a long time, you're constantly being made aware of how fluid cultures can be. You know, people in the 1930s were convinced that Germans and Japanese were absolutely unreformable militarists. It was deep in their genes. There was no way they could ever be persuaded to abandon militarism. It was just part of who Germans and Japanese were. Well, look at them now. I lived in Japan. It is a nation of pacifists. It really is. They're not very keen on the military. So cultures change. And I actually believe that Russia can change as well. But right now, I'm afraid change looks pretty far off and illusory.
When it comes to the future generations then, what do you think would be the unifying factor?
Well, that's a good question.
Because right now you have language.
Yeah, the Ukrainian language is, you know, has a lot of commonalities with Russian. It is a distinct language. It's not a dialect of Russian by any stretch of the imagination. It is a distinct language. And they have built up their own literary traditions, very, very rich cultural traditions. But there is a lot of shared history, right? The shared history of the Soviet Union, and going back way before that to the Russian Empire. So I often, you know, even when I'm in modern Ukraine, I sometimes notice things that I remember from the old Soviet Union. You know, habits of speech, or just the way that people do certain things, the way they keep their gardens. You know, there's a certain degree of shared cultural memory, which helps to explain why Ukrainians used to have a very pro-Russian viewpoint, right? They have a lot in common. And I don't think actually it would take that much to revive that commonality, that sense of shared history, if Russia, this is a big if, can recognize its collective responsibility for this horrible crime they've committed against the Ukrainians and show some remorse. The Russians do not have a great history of showing remorse for their conquests. I mean, maybe that's one reason why Trump likes them. They have zero sense of DEI. They are not woke in the slightest. They just conquer you and then they expect you to be happy about it. So I wonder if they will ever get to the point where, like the Japanese, like the Germans, they will be in a position to accept responsibility for what they've done and reflect on it and draw some positive lessons from it.
Both sides have had large numbers of casualties. We've seen a lot of damage on both sides, human and, basically societal infrastructure and so on. The Ukrainians are always saying, and the ones I've interviewed have always said, oh, we are defending our country, we're defending our country. In the case of the Russian soldiers, not a lot of information is put out. It's not in Russia's interest, of course. But what do you think is the toll it's taking on the Russian people, losing their sons and daughters to this conflict?
I actually think that toll is immense. We don't know for sure, again, as I wanted to emphasize before, we don't really know the state of public opinion in Russia. It's very important to say that. I sometimes see people citing poll numbers, from polls taken inside Vladimir Putin's Russia. That's a joke. I mean, you cannot call up people on the phone and ask their opinions in a police state. For the same reason I wouldn't trust public opinion polls in Iran or China, not to mention the blanketing effect of state propaganda. So it's a little hard to know what's going on in people's heads. But there's been an enormous loss of life. The British Defense Ministry estimates that Russian casualties, dead and wounded, now amount to well over 1 million. That's not an insignificant number of people. That has to have some effect. Russia is now on a wartime footing. A lot of the economy has shifted to war production. That, I think, has some positive effects for people, employment and, higher salaries. But it's terrible for the rest of the economy, and people are really starting to feel that through inflation and job shortages. And then finally, after the Soviet Union's war in Afghanistan, we saw a lot of those veterans come home and turn into organized criminals. And there was this immense wave of criminality through the Soviet Union and then post-Soviet Russia that was largely fueled by those returnees from the Afghan war. The Afghan war was pretty insignificant compared to this war. I mean, the number of brutalized Russian veterans coming home, traumatized and, suffering from substance abuse and barely coping, that's going to have a gigantic ripple effect throughout Russian society. I'm not optimistic about that part.
Especially as it's been drawn out so long now, the conflict, into
Yes.
its fourth year,
Yes.
well into its fourth year. What about the dependency Russia has on North Korean troops, for example?
Yes.
Was that necessary, considering the size of the Russian population?
Well, it is quite interesting, isn't it, Riz? I mean, why would such a big country as Russia feel compelled to accept troops from a relatively small ally like
What do you
North
think
Korea?
was the reason?
I think the reason is simply that Kim Jong-un was asking them for the chance to send his troops into combat. He wanted his troops to have combat experience. And Putin saw an opportunity to get more men in the field, and so he complied. But I think that does tell you something about the Russian manpower situation. We call the Russian style of warfare in Ukraine, the meat wave, the use of cannon fodder, just throwing people at the objective and not caring at all how many get mowed down. Very traditional Russian attitude towards warfighting. But this is not the Napoleonic Wars, right? We're not in World War I, where, by the way, Russian defeat on the battlefield led to revolution. I think Russian citizens actually have different expectations nowadays. They don't just want to send their kids off to be slaughtered for no particular reason. So even though you'll see a lot of, Russians celebrating this war on TV in Russia, I'm inclined to think that at home it's a different story.
It seemed after certainly the first year, where it was a lot of human-on-human interaction
Yes.
and conflict, things shifted to drones.
Yes.
And I think, if you consider modern warfare, it was the first time drones really became a major factor, it seems, in such a conflict. What was your assessment of how that drone warfare progressed?
Well, drone warfare has advanced by leaps and bounds in this war. And one of the reasons for that is that Ukraine has showed an incredible ability to adapt and innovate. And that is because their response to battlefield challenges has been very, very creative and largely unbureaucratic. A lot of the power to develop new equipment has been outsourced to people right on the front lines, not to the defense ministry, but to people who are actually in the action. I call it flat war. This is a very unhierarchical war, very unbureaucratic. So that has fueled this breakneck innovation. I think a lot of things I realize people don't know is that Ukraine was one of the heartlands of the Soviet defense industry during the Soviet Union. The best rocket engineers, aeronautics designers, a lot of them were Ukrainians. So there's this cliche of sort of Ukrainians as, rustic boobs. Not at all true. And that, legacy of engineering and technical knowledge passed over into post-Soviet Ukraine. And we're now seeing how widely that was, distributed among the technological elite and how flexibly they've applied it. But the problem is that Russia is adapting too, and in some cases very successfully. And of course, the latest iteration is the fiber optic drone, which is connected to the operator by a thin filament, which defeats electronic warfare, jamming and things like that. Yeah. And Ukraine is having a hard time catching up on that one. So for the first time, it really feels like the Russians are starting to get a little bit of an edge in the drone war.
If the kind of destruction that's occurring carries on, there's not going to be much of Ukraine for Russia to occupy or run, it would seem.
Well, I think that's a great point. You remember the idiotic American expression during the Vietnam War, you had to destroy the village to save it, right? And Russia has now basically destroyed eastern Ukraine in order to save it for Russia. There are not a lot of people still living in some of those places that Russia has annexed. People loyal to the government in Kiev have, of course, fled. A lot of other people have moved away, just tried not to live there. I mean, you see the footage of these places, it looks like footage from World War I, in Verdun or something. It's grim. I mean, there are parts of Ukraine that will take, decades to rebuild, but a lot of the worst damage is on the Russian side of the line.
I was going to say, I mean, for Russia also to recover, it's going to take a lot of money, it's going to take a lot of effort, and again, the ultimate outcome is how are these two countries going to interact?
Yeah. I was in Chechnya, by the way, in 2000, Riz, and after the end of the Second Chechen War, and I saw the capital of Chechnya, Grozny, which looked like something out of World War II. It looked like it had been bombed by multiple air raids, hit by multiple air raids in World War II. Absolutely devastated. And Putin decided the way to bring Chechnya back into Russia was by simply picking a Chechen dictator whose son is now still in power and pouring in billions and billions and billions of dollars that they could basically use as they want it. So they rebuilt it into this amazing city. But that took decades, hundreds of billions of dollars, and for an area the size of Vermont. Eastern Ukraine, that's going to be a whole different ballpark. I mean, it's a bit of a poison pill, I think, actually. Fine, take your, 4 eastern districts of Ukraine. Good luck with that. Yeah, you've destroyed all the industrial capacity. You chased away most of the human resources. Now you get to have it.
But the trouble is also guerrilla tactics would come into play and the resistance would build.
Yeah, well, and that is happening now. It's a great observation, Riz, because in a lot of those places under Russian occupation, there's a really vibrant resistance movement going on, sabotage, assassinations. It's not at all quiet and docile there.
So Vladimir Putin is building his relationship with other countries in order to kind of bolster his position, and especially growing with North Korea, it seems as well. Yeah. What's going to be the relationship growth between those two countries as a result of this? And what does North Korea get out of it?
Well, that's a great question. So last year, Putin went to North Korea. He was received with great fanfare. And after that, Russia and North Korea signed a friendship treaty that aligned them even more closely than they had been aligned before, which is actually pretty close. So what do the two sides get out of it? Russia gets North Korean troops. Most importantly, perhaps, it gets artillery shells, because North Korea makes a lot of those and has a lot of those in its weapons depots. You can't have too many of those, okay? So that's those are two really important things, soldiers and shells. What does North Korea get out of it? North Korea gets a closer relationship with the Russians. They are probably getting Russian energy, which is absolutely vital for them. And they are getting combat experience. That is something that Kim is very, very interested in. To be sure, a lot of their troops have simply been getting mowed down on the battlefield, but the ones who don't have gone back to North Korea, and they've imparted lessons to other soldiers there. And I think that's the one thing that Kim thought his armed forces were really lacking. You know, they have not had an active foe in many, many years. Now they're getting amazing, up-to-date combat experience on a 2025 battlefield. And any veteran will tell you, you can train all day, you can come up with the most brilliant weapons. Combat experience is everything. There's nothing like the experience of actually fighting in a war against an enemy.
Now, information out of Russia is not that easily gleaned.
Yes.
And it's hard to know what real support Vladimir Putin has. Now, I know you said you suspect it's quite a lot. What's going on with President Zelensky? Now there seems to be some backlash, at least.
Yes, well, there have been a lot of criticisms of President Zelensky by pro-democracy activists in Ukraine. I remember talking to some of them back in 2023. They were worried about certain things that were happening. And now I think those concerns have really come out into the open because Zelensky, pushed through this law in Parliament that was designed to eliminate the independence of anti-corruption watchdogs. And the thing is that those anti-corruption institutions are not just random things. They are the very centerpiece of Ukraine's evolution as a democracy. Ukrainians have put enormous amount and effort and blood and tears into building up this anti-corruption infrastructure with very active support, I might add, for the Americans and the Europeans, because corruption was seen as one of the biggest problems in Ukraine. Again, a legacy of the old Soviet Union. And passing the legislation for those institutions and embedding them in the Ukrainian government was a huge triumph for pro-democracy forces. And by trying to clamp down on them and subordinate them to the government, Zelensky seems to have committed a pretty major error because people took to the streets. That's what Ukrainians do when they don't like something that you're doing. And they don't treat Zelensky like some kind of idol who's above criticism. It's not how they think. It's just not, and he's clearly made a big mistake, and now he's promised to reverse it. I'm curious to see if he will actually follow through on that.
Has the recent change, where now Donald Trump is pointing the finger at Vladimir Putin, for example, really improved Vladimir Zelensky's position? Or is he simply on the sidelines watching?
No, I think it's improved his position to a large extent. If nothing else, it has boosted his position with the Europeans. And again, we Americans talk about ourselves a lot. We love to talk about the United States. But Europe is a pretty big force in all of this. They have actually supplied more financial aid to Ukraine than the United States has, which is perfectly reasonable because they're right next door. It's really their problem. And now they're really picking up speed on the military aspect as well. So, I don't think many Americans realize just how active the Europeans have become. So I think that Trump's shift has enabled the Europeans to embrace Zelensky even more strongly, and also, very importantly, to criticize him when he needs to be criticized, as they have done in the wake of this stupid move to curb the anti-corruption agencies. So I don't know. We'll see how it goes. The other important thing, Riz, of course, is that now within Europe, there are a number of different, especially in terms of security, there are different speeds as far as defense policy. And interestingly enough, it's the Nordics, the Scandinavian countries, the Poles, the Brits who are outside of Europe but in NATO, who have been especially tough on Russia and especially passionate in their defense of Ukraine. Some of the other European countries, a little less so, other countries in the middle. But you've got this sort of multi-speed NATO, as it were. And that, I think, actually is a good thing because it enables the countries that are really determined to support Ukraine to be able to do it.
It seems that NATO's backing of Ukraine to this degree probably wasn't what Vladimir Putin would have expected.
Well, exactly right, Riz. He clearly did not expect it. When he invaded Ukraine in 2014, the West basically yawned, and imposed a couple of small sanctions, but he got away with it. Let's be frank. The West rolled over. So I think he was expecting that to happen this time too. Whatever the West threw at him, he could take it. And lo and behold, he has, by doing this, revitalized Western defense. Sweden and Finland have joined NATO. I don't think that would have ever happened without this invasion. And now we've got a whole different ballgame as far as NATO is concerned. And, Trump is to be praised, in my view, for getting tough with the Europeans and making them spend more on defense. But I think we've now reached a point where they don't need to be persuaded. A lot of them are doing it themselves.
What do you think, Christian, is the worst case scenario for Ukraine going forward?
That's a good question. I think the worst case scenario is the United States completely abandoning any sort of commitment to Ukraine. To see more of these right-wing extremist parties come to power in Europe, which would then dilute European support for Ukraine. Ukraine desperately needs support from the West to keep going. I don't think they'd just give up without it, but of course the fight becomes much, much harder. So I think the Ukrainians will keep fighting no matter what. I remember a taxi driver telling me that if they took Kiev, people were going to go back to what they were doing in the late 40s and early 50s when there were anti-Soviet guerrillas in the woods fighting Soviet troops still long after the Second World War ended. So I don't think anybody would be giving up. But of course, the fight becomes much harder without foreign support.
So then what's the worst case scenario for Russia?
I think the worst case scenario is that a strong and revitalized NATO pushes ahead really decisively with support for Ukraine, seizes all of the assets, the Russian financial assets that have been frozen, mostly in Europe. It's about $300 billion. It's quite a nice chunk of change, and that would finance a lot of weapons for Ukraine. I think that would be very difficult for the Russians. And I think a major economic downturn would be a huge problem for Putin. He's managed to get by so far with some very clever management from some of his technocrats. But I think, collapse in the oil price would pretty much do him in. So, and then, collapse of the Putin regime itself, I think, is probably the worst case scenario for the Russian regime. It might be a good case scenario for the Russian people.
Well, you have the advantage, Christian, of being able to go to places like Russia and Ukraine, speak directly to people, so it's not through interpretation. When are you heading back to that region? Do you know?
I don't know. I hope to be going back to Ukraine sometime in the not too distant future, but that's very unclear. I just came back from Georgia, which is another place that used to be part of the Soviet Union. And there's an authoritarian government, very pro-Russian authoritarian government. This is very aggressively asserting control after decades of democracy. And so that's a very ominous sign of how things are going in parts of the former Soviet Union.
Are you optimistic in any way that there will be a comprehensive and lasting ceasefire anytime soon between Ukraine and Russia?
I'm cautiously optimistic, as the diplomats like to say. I'm cautiously optimistic. I think it's quite possible. Time is not on the Ukrainian side. They're the first ones who will tell you that. Putin thinks that he has the advantage because he can go on and on and on. I don't think he has maybe quite as much time as he thinks he does, but that's how he views the situation. Ukrainians will tell you, you know, we can't win an attritional war. We just don't have the people. We don't have the resources. You know, we can't stretch this out forever. So I would hope to see us reaching a point where, whether it be through international pressure or internal economic problems, Russia has to kind of call it a draw and lay down its guns. That doesn't mean they'd be pulling out of eastern Ukraine. They might be staying there for the foreseeable future. But the point is, we cannot recognize that in legal and political terms. We can have a ceasefire and armistice, as we did in Korea, and move on from there.
And this is where it comes down to finding solutions that work for both countries. And that's the tricky part now, isn't it?
That's very much the tricky part.
Well, Christian, I know I'm going to be speaking with you again. Thank you so much for making the time.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Riz. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. Christian Caryl of Foreign Policy magazine there, giving us a closer look at the latest developments in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. That's it for now. Don't forget to subscribe and leave your comments. I'll see you next time.